So good morning. My name is Bill Parks. I'm a professor in medicine at Cedars-Sinai and here at UCLA, although I spend essentially all my time at UCLA. So I'm basically going to give you the same talk you just heard, but from a different perspective. There will be points of redundancy, but those points of redundancy between what I will present and what Carol just presented are things that we both would view to be very important. So what I'm going to talk about is I'm really going to focus on submitting your first R01 application and talk about preparation and timelines. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about are the reviewers and the review criteria. So I spent a lot of my time, a lot of my life being involved in NIH review. And so I'm going to present my suggestions to you from the perspective of the reviewer, what you want to do to keep your reviewers happy, and talk about the criterion for the investigator, in particular, preparing your Biosketch. At one point, I think a lot of junior investigators make some mistakes at, and just close with some very simple presentation tips. So this is where you are. You're making that transition from the K to the R grant. And this is my central reservation, one that served me very well when I was going from postdoc to faculty member and writing my first R-series grant as I read other grants. And ideally successful grants, but if you can read unsuccessful grants, that may give you some insights as well. That to me helped a lot, and I've spoken to many colleagues over the years who have mirrored that. Another recommendation is that there are these groups that you can pay to give you advice. Now, I don't want to be cynical about this, but when I've looked into it, it's like the people teaching this, as far as I can tell, have never held grants. So I would get advice from people who have wrote successful grant applications and who are involved in the review process. So preparation and timelines. So you just saw part of this is the 3 cycles for submitting an R01, a new R01. So let's give an example of how much time it would take. Now, one thing you need to understand is that you don't submit the grant. The institution submits the grants to the NIH site, grants.gov. And it could be that your institutional deadline is a little bit different from the NIH because they need to have all the paperwork in beforehand. The other thing you need to understand, you're not the only one submitting a grant at a cycle. At a place like UCLA, there would probably be hundreds. And there could be a log jam. So advice is try to get your work done well on time. So let's give you an example of what that time would look like. So let's say you're aiming for a February 5th, 2018 submission date. What would that require? So by now, you have already started to think and plan what that R01 is going to be. We're in November of 2017. So from now until the beginning of next year is when you would start doing the writing, getting feedback on that grant. And one thing I advise is the administrative stuff, budgets, making sure IRB, animals, whatever the administrative stuff is, get that done and out of the way early so you can focus on the scientific part. Then the grant will be submitted in February. By June of 2018 is when it goes through the first review. If you got a good score, you will get the money. The grant will start in December of 2018 and you're funded. But that hardly ever happens. As we just saw the data Carol showed, very few grants get funded on the first submission. We live in a world of revision. So in June 2008, if you got a fair score, you will get your written critiques probably in less than a month later. So realistically, the next time you can resubmit the revised application, the A1, would be October of 2018. That would get reviewed in February 2019. You get a good score, you get funded, you get the money in July 2019. So realistically, this is a 2-year process, and something to keep in mind as you're planning this. Now, I won't go through all these things, but among the things that you should be doing well in advance are highlighted on here. One is, and this is what Carol's saying, present your idea and aims to your colleagues, both in formal and informal settings. Ask people to read your aims and give them plenty of time. do not, as what recently happened to me, someone said, could you go over my grant and if I have to submit this in 2 days. And that's unrealistic. It's better to give people plenty of time where I could read what has to be read, think about it, maybe reread it, and then give you a very cogent interpretation. Of course, know the literature, generate the needed preliminary data really to support all your hypotheses. Preliminary data are a very important part of a successful R grant to show that you can do things. And then publish. The importance of this cannot be stressed. Now, I'm one of these people who tend to believe in quality over quantity, but the realistic thing is you got to have papers. Now, I'm not saying you have to have a lot of papers, but you have to have publications. Grants is a competition. You're competing against other people. As early stage investigators, if an early stage investigator, you both write a grant that's scientifically equivalent, but they have more publications than you, and you don't have publications, well, guess who gets the grant? All right. So again, read successful applications because they'll give you a clear idea. And I do believe somewhere on the NIH they have examples of R01s. And I have looked at these some years ago, and they are indeed beautiful grants. All right. And again, also be aware of the institution rules and deadlines. Now, I won't go through this, but know the things that the NIH wants, like page limits and other formatting things that were just discussed, and it's true that if you don't adhere to some of these, the NIH will kick your grant right back. All right. So the review process. So I'm just going to discuss briefly how applications are evaluated, but I also want to discuss what I consider to be the things that matters to the reviewers. So this is the organization of the National Institutes for Health. And it's divided up into, as I'm sure you all know, a series of institutes largely based on disease or organ questions, so, such as National Cancer Institute or National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. In addition, there's another institute, the Center for Scientific Review, and they're the ones responsible for the review of many applications that are sent to the NIH. Not all, but most of them. All the others, the one in blue and gold, are the ones that actually fund money. The CSR does not. So how are grants reviewed? So K awards, and many of you have K awards, if they went to the NIH for review, they are typically reviewed by the institute that is supporting it, by their own internal study sections. But when you get to R01s and R21s and other RPGs, they are essentially all reviewed, unless you're responding to a specific request for applications. They're all reviewed by study sections organized by the scientific review. Then after that review, it goes to a second round of review, which then goes back to the institute for a specific council. So it's not a rigorous review. Basically, what the council say, if you got a score that's within their pay line, they give you their money. All right. So just the fate of your application. So you write the grant, you send it to your grant office, they submit it to the NIH, to the CSR, Center for Scientific Review, then they assign it to a study section and the institute. It goes to the reviewers, and then it comes back to you. You actually have some influence over this project, and the NIH will ask you to submit a cover letter. You can suggest what institute it should be assigned. Now, how does a grant get assigned? It's usually there's someone at the CSR reads it, the abstract, and there's something you're going to write in the first sentence of the abstract will seal that fate. So if you write liver in the first sentence, it'll go to NIDDK, for example. All right, you can suggest the study section it goes to. You can identify conflicts. If it's going to the study section, you can see who sits on the study section. If you think that there's someone who you may have potential conflict with, identify that person. The NIH typically respects that. If you think you need other expertise for review, fine. The one thing you should not do is recommend a specific reviewer. Like your parents or your best friend. The NIH will absolutely not respect that. All right, and Carol talked on this of who are the people you interact with. Basically, it's the two people, the program officer who is institute-based and the scientific review officer who, for an R01, is typically going to be with the CSR, but they could be institute-based depending on who's doing it. So before you submit your application, the program officer is someone you can interact with. Once you submit it, you will typically interact with the scientific review officer. And once it's reviewed and all the way through the second submission, if needed, and afterwards through the life of the grant, if it's funded, you interact with your program officer. And the program officer, as Carol was pointing out, is actually someone you should make contact with, because they have an influence on funding. One thing they can do in this scheme here is that if they really like your grant and you didn't get funded but you got a good score, they have the means of actually funding that grant temporarily. It's called an R56. They can give you 1 year's worth of funding, and they typically give you the full budget that you requested because they're trying to promote you. So knowing who your program officer is and having some relationship with that person is a wise thing to do. So study sections. As I said, they're largely run through the Center for Scientific Review, and they deal with 80,000 applications per year. There's over 220 study sections. Typically, a study section has about 24 members, and each member has to review 10 to 12 applications per meeting. And I'll get back to that. That's an important number. All right. And you can find out all the information on the study sections at the CSR website. And study sections are advisory. They don't fund application. They're only there to evaluate the scientific merit of the application, as well as to judge that you adhere to all the other bureaucratic things that we have to include in a grant. Who's on study sections? Not surprisingly, most of the people on it are senior investigators. And essentially all members on a study section have successfully earned an R01, and typically through that study section. So they're cognizant of the topic of the scientific topics that study section revolves. So the review process. So applications are made available to the reviewers about 6 weeks before. They review it. And I'm not going to go through this because I'll touch on these things in the next presentation I give. But everything is done online beforehand, and the scores are submitted about 1 week before. I mean, that's not terribly important. This is important, though. Something to understand is, when do reviewers review your application? Now remember, I just said they have 10 to 12 that they have to review. Each application, R01, is 12 pages plus specific aims, so that's 13 times 10, that's 130 if I'm doing the math right, plus all the other sections, biosketches, animals, blah, blah, blah. So let's round it up to, they have 200 printed pages that they have to read quite carefully, write evaluations on. It's a fair bit of work and takes a fair bit of time. And they tend to do it at home. Many of the reviewers are established folks. They're always traveling around giving talks, so reading them on a plane is a good place to do it. And they do it at the last minute. They get them all done at once, the weekend before the deadline is. So the reviewers can be stressed, anxious, and not terribly sympathetic to you. So do not make the reviewer read papers or go to the internet. All right? All the relevant information for your application has to be within that document. Also, do not make the reviewer think. Now, you can, what I mean is, don't make them form your conclusions. If you're discussing preliminary data, you should say at the end of a paragraph, thus, these data indicate blah, blah, blah. Include that sentence. Make your conclusions. Take the reviewer by the hand and walk them through your proposal and what you're thinking. All right. So one thing you want to do is never tick off the reviewer. And some of the things I'll highlight in the rest of this talk are things that can make reviewers unhappy. So this is what study section actually looks like. It begins at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time when we're on the West Coast. So for us who come from here, we're starting at 5 a.m. And it's a jam room, and several of us are jet lagged. It's not a pleasant situation at all. And what happens is that we discuss the grants, from the best scored grant to the worst scored grant based on their preliminary scores in order. And the ones that ranked at the lower 50% are not discussed. You may have heard the term triage, but the actual term is not discussed. And typically it's about 15 to 20 minutes per application. And you go to about 6 to 7 p.m. and repeat the next day. And it can be stressful. So not that many years ago, I was chairing one of these study sections. As chair, you have to pay attention and listen to every grant. And when we were approaching 6 o'clock, and the last grant, my brain just shut down. I just I couldn't. I was supposed to give a summary, and I just couldn't do it. You know. So if you make your reviewers happy, they'll support your grant. If you don't, then yes. All right. Review criteria. These are the criteria on which the reviewers will evaluate your grant, and it's different for an art grant compared to either the F series or K series grant that many of you probably have already written. So for the training grants or career development grants, a large focus on how they're evaluated is on the training potential. That's a big part. But once you get to the R series grant, the focus is largely on the science. So significance, the experimental approach, and the investigator. So the science and you are really the key aspects of how those grants are evaluated. When you submit the grant, these are all the various documents that are applied. And since I made this slide, which was last year, and I had to add one bullet point, but I think they keep adding new things that we have to add. So this is probably not a complete list. These are the sections that the reviewers care about. Now, I'm not saying that you can ignore these other things because they have to be there. But when these are the sections that the reviewers will read to evaluate your grant so they can score the criteria. And these are the sections that they really care about. So the Biosketch and the research strategy and specific aims are the key part of the grant. So later on in this, there's going to be talks on specific aims and research strategies, but I'm going to talk about Biosketch. And I want to start that discussion here because Biosketch is one area where, in my experience, where I've seen many junior investigators make mistakes. So when you look at this graph, there's definitely information there, right? But you're really confused about what this means, that there's just things that are missing and out of place. But when it's more complete, now you can start getting a picture. Oh, it's time and it's expression of something. I don't know if it's messenger RNA or protein, but those must be the expression of those factors. So it's much clearer of what that graph's trying to tell you. And basically, when we look at data like this, it's spatial information. All right? We have X, Y axis, lines moving across us. It gives us a lot of information. And a Biosketch provides spatial information as well. So this is what our Biosketch looks like. And the main thing of it is to show what you have done. So some things is when you're listing education and training should be there and include the month and the year. Something that's asked, not everyone includes it. Not a terrible thing if you lack that. Then there's a personal statement. My recommendation on that is to keep it succinct. And for early stage investigators is to maybe highlight aspects of your training and career goals. And you can list 4 publications under there as well. For clinicians, I would say just talk briefly about gaps in your training. So when you're working as a clinician and you're not doing any research, you haven't published during that period of time, most likely. But I've heard reviewers say, oh, well, they weren't productive during this period, and people have to point out to them, well, that's because they were doing their residency. And so just point out gaps in your research training. But then the dirty secret of the personal statement, and I invite my colleagues here who have been reviewing grants, is that hardly anyone ever reads it anyways. Right? Right? Okay. So that's why I say keep it short. Also, this one here on the CSR's do's and don'ts of the Biosketch is worth reading. That's a worthy document. When you get down to positions are not training, right? So if you were a postdoc in a lab, that's a training position. It's not a position. I do not like to see things duplicated under positions that are also in education. I like to see them distinct. All right, the big part of it is the Biosketch are the publications. And I would say without exception, I have not met one person who reviews grants who likes this new NIH format. But regardless, it's what we have to live with. So you can list up to 5 areas. You don't need to list 5. And as early stage investigators, that is relevant to you. But one thing is, do not include abstracts of publications. All right? And Another thing, do not include abstracts as publications. That is something that really annoys reviewers. Make sure your publications are up to date. So, in press, 2009. No, we want the complete thing. Also, the full citation. Now, yes, if you're on a paper with 100 authors, maybe you can trim it down because that may eat up a lot of space, but you should have the full citation there. Also, this is possibly one of the more important bits of advice, consistent formatting among the publications you list. So this is a spatial information thing I was talking about. When we look at your publications, there are three things that we're looking, or at least I'm looking for. I want to see where your name is in the order of the authors. I want to see what year it was published in and what journal it was in. And so I want to be able to see those in the same place. Particularly, the thing that flops around is the year of publication. And also, if you can highlight it, underline your name, put the journal in italics or bold or something like that. But a consistent format is important. Did your name change somewhere in your career? Let us know somewhere on the CV. Also important, what you list here should match what we see on PubMed. Because almost without exception, what the reviewer will do, because no one likes this NIH format, they just go to PubMed anyway and look at your publications. And PubMed gives us the consistent format, and shows us your publications in chronological order. But there's a few times in my career where I've seen publications listed here for people. This is like someone's a co-first author, but they're the second position author, but on their CV they make themselves the first author. That's co-first author. Who cares who first or second, right? But then you go to PubMed, and they're in the second position. Now, what's your thinking? Is that allowed? No, it's not. You should do exactly the way it was published. If you're a co-first author, there's actually a reason you're in the second slot. Right? Any questions about that?
How would you prefer us saying we're co-first author?
Oh, it's the typical way. You put asterisks next to the co-first authors and just parenthetically. And I would say when the co-first author thing came out sometime late last century, people were typically a little cynical about it. But I think the community has really changed and embraced it, and we realize, if you're a co-first author, you get full credit. Just don't change your order where your name appears. Okay. Also, I think for early stage investigators, there is some leeway in here. So as an established investigator, we're not allowed to put abstracts on our NIH bio. But I think it's okay for you to do it. Like if you do it as I recommended here, under abstracts or presentations, because that's letting the reviewer know that you are at least getting out and communicating your science to others. And that's important. But just don't list them as publications. So Carol touched on this a bit, the early stage investigator and how it's defined. The important thing about the early stage investigator, the break you get on the pay line varies by institute. So look at where you're submitting. And if you can, turn your work into something that Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute would like to fund, because as an early stage investigator, their pay line is 26%. Which is pretty dang high. So some of the other breaks is the quality and relevance of your publications are important, but we're supposed to not really focus on the number of publications rather than quality, but there's the reality. And this isn't opposed to established investigators where it's really our track record productivity. Now there's two other investigator definitions that the NIH has. One is that has been used for a long time. Carol mentioned this as a new investigator, and this is someone who's never had an RPG grant. There's no age limit on this, but there's very few institutes that support this, with NIAID being, I think, the sole exception that supports this, giving a break to new investigators. There's also the early established investigator that Carol talked about, so that is you're within 10 years of your first grant, and you're at risk of losing it, so they'll give you a break there. But again, that also varies by institute, so you have to understand where your grant goes. These rules, particularly the early stage investigator handicap, has actually had an impact. So at the last of the end of last century and the beginning of this century, there was this notable gap between the success rate of new investigators, meaning early stage investigators, and established investigators. Now, even though the green line drops down, that drops down because of basically the dropping of the NIH budget as a function of inflation. But what has happened is that the blue line has now met the green line, and now they're tracking. So the rate of success of early stage investigators is matching that of established investigators. And I think that this was a huge improvement. Before the early stage investigator rules kicked in, which was around 2005, 2006, I would guess, the NIH had many other ideas for us on study section to give breaks to new investigators. And really, I don't think any of them were effective until they actually came into something like, okay, we give them 10 extra points on the pay line. So it has actually had an effect. So independence. So the rule for discussing independence at a study section is that you can't discuss it. You can't even say the word. When we're discussing an early stage investigator, we cannot say the word independence. So it doesn't affect the scoring. It's not a review criteria. The reality is, it's in the reviewer's mind. And if you remain associated with your mentor, I suggest getting a letter from her confirming that you are independent, that just say, oh, this grant represents their ideas and such. And my advice is do not include your mentor as key personnel on your grant. And if it happens that you're occupying, your lab is within their lab, don't say that in your resource or facilities page. Just say that you occupy X number of square feet in building so-and-so. All right? So remove that from the reviewer's concern because it is something reviewers are sensitive to. So one thing I'll just finish with is presentation. So one is zero tolerance for typos. And I give this talk in various stages. I was giving it to a postdoc group at Cedars, and someone went, oh, but you have a typo up there. And yes, I do. So zero tolerance, and that's one of the going back to advice that you heard both from Carol and I, is to go through multiple iterations of your grant, have other people read it, and typos, reviewers just react to them. Avoid excessive use of abbreviations. So when I'm reviewing a grant, I have to use short-term memory to remember what you have. If you start throwing a lot of abbreviations at me, I have to waste my short-term memory using those. Yes, you can use an abbreviation like DNA is probably okay. But it's those lab jargon ones where you have a cell line in your lab and you call it ABCD cell line. And then you have another one, ABCF cell line. And I did review a grant like this where the cell lines had very similar names, and it was very difficult for me to distinguish them while reading the grant. So avoid the use of abbreviations as much as you can. Also avoid vague terms like effect and influences, like factor X influences the expression of factor 10. No, say that it stimulates it, it downregulates it, be precise. Also avoid pleonasms. These are excess words. You know, insulin has been shown to regulate glucose. Insulin regulates glucose. Less syllables, easier, clearer language. Now, that said, I do use has been shown when I want to be dismissive. Like, although it's been shown that so-and-so does this, those were done in non-physiologic models. So, the one exception. That's the only time I use has been shown. So, one thing is learn how to use clean, concise language. And using the active voice and a simple, clear language. And if you haven't read it, Strunk and White's Element of Style, which was written around 1920, is still a very relevant book, still available, and it's very short. It's short because it's telling you how to write succinctly. Another very good book is How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper by, I believe, Robert Day. It's in multiple ones. This is written with he's a great writer, he has a great sense of humor, and he has tables on common pleonasms, these excess phrases that we use in science that he thinks can all be removed. And this thing about simple language actually has an impact. So there was this one study by a psychologist at Princeton University that said that the ability of readers to understand what is written is more difficult if they use complex language, big words. So, and a very good title for that paper. Also, paragraphs and spaces. Don't make the thing look dense or cluttered. So remember, I was saying that reviewers have to read 130 plus pages of your narratives. And so here's two examples. What would you rather read? 13 pages of the one on the left or the one on the right? So spaces between your paragraphs make things delineated and easy to see. And then flow, a logical transition from sentence to sentence, paragraph to paragraph. Again, do the work for your reader. This thing that I said at the beginning, don't make your reviewer think. And it's always good to use some system to outline your sections and subsections, as long as it's not excessively complex. But again, as I said at the beginning, read successful applications, because you will see what they have done. And I think that is as I said at the beginning, my central advice. So I'll stop there, and good luck with your presentation.